In the darkest days of World War II, when the fate of the entire Pacific hung by a thread, thousands of young men found themselves thrown into a green hell that would test every ounce of their courage and endurance. The Solomon Islands campaign was not just another battle in a distant ocean, but a turning point that would determine whether freedom or tyranny would rule the waves of the Pacific for generations to come. Imagine dense jungles where the very air felt like breathing through wet cloth, where malaria and dysentery killed as many men as enemy bullets, where the ocean itself became a graveyard for ships and sailors, and where the night sky lit up with the fury of naval battles so fierce they would become legend. This is the story of ordinary men who fought an extraordinary war across a chain of tropical islands that most had never heard of before being sent there to fight and die. This is the story of how determination, sacrifice, and the will to survive against impossible odds changed the course of history in the Pacific theater, and proved that even in the face of a seemingly unstoppable enemy advance, courage could turn the tide of war. When Japanese forces swept across the Pacific in the months following their devastating attack on Pearl Harbor in December 1941, it seemed as though nothing could stop their relentless advance southward and eastward. The rising sun flag flew over conquered territories from the frozen Aleutian Islands in the north to the tropical paradise of the Dutch East Indies in the south, and every week brought news of another Allied defeat, another strategic position lost, another island chain falling under Japanese control. The Solomon Islands, a scattered archipelago of mountainous jungle-covered islands northeast of Australia, had been relatively peaceful and unimportant in the global scheme of things before the war. Known mainly for coconut plantations and small trading posts where European colonists and native Melanesians lived side by side in the slow rhythm of tropical life. But geography has a way of making obscure places suddenly vital in wartime, and the Solomons sat astride the sea lanes between the United States and Australia, making them a strategic prize that neither side could afford to ignore. When Japanese forces began occupying islands in the northern Solomons in early 1942, building bases and airfields that could threaten the critical Allied supply lines to Australia, American military planners realized that the enemy advance had to be stopped here, or the entire Southwest Pacific might fall under Japanese domination. The decision to launch Operation Watchtower, the code name for the invasion of Guadalcanal and Chilagi in the southern Solomon Islands, came at a time when America was still reeling from defeat after defeat and desperately needed a victory to prove that Japanese expansion could be halted and reversed. Intelligence reports revealed that Japanese construction crews were building an airfield on Guadalcanal, a large island covered in steaming jungle and fronted by beaches of black volcanic sand. And Allied commanders knew that if that airfield became operational, enemy bombers would be able to strike shipping routes and threaten Australia itself. The Americans decided to strike first, launching their first major offensive operation of the Pacific War on August 7, 1942, when United States Marines stormed ashore on Guadalcanal and the smaller nearby island of Chilagi. The Marines who waded through the surf that morning were mostly young men who had never seen combat before, carrying heavy packs in the oppressive tropical heat, uncertain what resistance they would face but determined to prove themselves in battle. The initial landings met surprisingly light resistance on Guadalcanal itself, because the Japanese had not expected an Allied counteroffensive so soon, and the Marines quickly pushed inland toward the nearly completed airfield that would soon be renamed Henderson Field after a Marine pilot killed at the Battle of Midway. But on Chilagi and the tiny islands of Gavutu and Tanambogo nearby, Japanese defenders fought with a ferocity that shocked the young Marines, refusing to surrender and fighting to the death from caves and fortified positions, giving the Americans their first taste of the brutal combat style that would characterize the entire Pacific War. The capture of the unfinished Japanese airfield on Guadalcanal gave the Marines a vital asset, but holding it would prove far more difficult than taking it in the first place. Henderson Field became the center of the entire Guadalcanal campaign, the objective that both sides fought desperately to control, because whoever owned that muddy strip of land held the key to air superiority over the southern Solomons. American engineers and construction crews worked around the clock to complete the runway and make it operational for American aircraft, while Marines dug defensive positions in the jungle around the perimeter, knowing that Japanese counterattacks would come soon and would come hard. The first planes to land at Henderson Field were a mixed group of Marine fighters and dive bombers that would become known as the Cactus Air Force, named after the American codename for Guadalcanal, and these pilots and their ground crews would perform miracles of improvisation and courage in the months ahead. Flying planes that were often damaged and patched together with scavenged parts, operating from a runway that turned into a mud pit when it rained and filled with clouds of dust when it was dry, constantly under threat of Japanese air raids and naval bombardment. The Cactus Air Force pilots flew mission after mission, defending the airfield and attacking Japanese positions and shipping with a determination born of desperation. They knew that if Henderson Field fell, the Marines on the ground would be cut off and likely destroyed. So they flew even when they were exhausted, even when their planes were barely airworthy, even when the odds seemed hopeless. For the Marines fighting on the ground, Guadalcanal became a nightmare of heat, disease, hunger, and sudden violence that tested them in ways they had never imagined. The jungle itself was an enemy as formidable as the Japanese soldiers who moved through it with practiced ease, using the dense vegetation for concealment and launching surprise attacks before melting back into the green darkness. Marines quickly learned that the jungle fought them at every step, with thorny vines that tore at their uniforms and skin, with insects that spread malaria and dengue fever, with humidity so oppressive that men could barely breathe, and with leeches that attached themselves to any exposed flesh and had to be burned off with cigarettes. Food was scarce because supply ships had to run a gauntlet of Japanese submarines and aircraft to reach Guadalcanal, and Marines often survived on captured Japanese rice mixed with whatever they could scavenge, losing weight at an alarming rate and suffering from malnutrition on top of disease. Sleep was almost impossible because Japanese forces made a practice of infiltrating American lines at night, sometimes launching full-scale attacks and sometimes just firing random shots and shouting in English to keep the Marines on edge and exhausted. The psychological strain of never knowing when the enemy might appear, of hearing movement in the darkness and not knowing if it was a Japanese soldier or just an animal, of watching friends die from disease or enemy fire, wore down even the strongest men and created a kind of numbing fatigue that went beyond mere physical exhaustion. While Marines fought and died on Guadalcanal itself, the waters around the Solomon Islands became the scene of naval battles that would prove just as crucial to the campaign's outcome as the fighting on land. The first major clash came on the night of August 9th, just 2 days after the initial landings, when a Japanese naval force surprised Allied warships near Savo Island and inflicted one of the worst defeats in United States naval history. In less than an hour of chaotic night fighting, Japanese cruisers sank 4 Allied heavy cruisers and damaged others, killing more than 1,000 sailors and demonstrating that Japan still ruled the seas around the Solomons despite the American foothold on Guadalcanal. The Battle of Savo Island sent shockwaves through the Allied command and forced the withdrawal of the supply ships and transports that had been supporting the Marines, leaving the men on Guadalcanal feeling abandoned and uncertain whether reinforcements and supplies would ever arrive. But the Americans learned from their defeat and began developing better tactics for night fighting, installing radar on their ships, and training their crews in the kind of close-range combat that characterized naval battles in the confined waters between the Solomon Islands. Over the following months, the waters off Guadalcanal would see battle after battle as both sides struggled to reinforce their troops on the island and prevent the enemy from doing the same, turning the channel between Guadalcanal and the neighboring islands into what sailors grimly called Iron Bottom Sound because of all the ships that lay wrecked on the ocean floor. Japanese forces developed an ingenious method of reinforcing and resupplying their troops on Guadalcanal while minimizing exposure to American air power during daylight hours, a system that American forces nicknamed the Tokyo Express, but which the Japanese called the Rat Run. Fast destroyers and cruisers would race down from Japanese bases in the northern Solomons under cover of darkness, arriving off Guadalcanal after sunset to unload troops and supplies, or to bombard Henderson Field with their heavy guns, then racing back north before dawn could expose them to American aircraft. The Tokyo Express runs became a regular feature of the Guadalcanal campaign, and American forces could often predict when the Japanese ships would arrive but found them difficult to stop because of their speed and the advantage of darkness. The nightly bombardments from Japanese warships made life miserable for the Marines and airmen around Henderson Field, sending them diving into foxholes and shelters as heavy shells crashed down on the runway and surrounding areas, sometimes for hours at a time. The psychological impact of these bombardments was enormous, denying men sleep and creating a constant state of anxiety, but the physical damage was often repaired quickly by work crews who filled in bomb craters and patched the runway as soon as the Japanese ships departed. The Tokyo Express kept Japanese forces on Guadalcanal supplied and reinforced enough to continue fighting, but it was never quite enough to give them the overwhelming advantage they needed to retake Henderson Field and drive the Americans into the sea. In mid-September 1942, Japanese forces launched one of their most determined efforts to recapture Henderson Field, concentrating their attacks on a ridge south of the airfield that was defended by Marine raiders and paratroopers under the command of Colonel Merritt Edson. The battle that followed over 2 nights of savage fighting would become known as the Battle of Edson's Ridge or sometimes as the Battle of Bloody Ridge, and it represented one of the critical moments when the entire Guadalcanal campaign hung in the balance. Japanese forces attacked in waves, often at night when they felt they had the advantage, charging up the slopes of the ridge with fixed bayonets while their officers waved swords and shouted encouragement, believing that their superior fighting spirit would overcome American firepower. The Marines dug in along the ridge, fought back with everything they had, firing rifles and machine guns until the barrels glowed red-hot, throwing grenades down the slopes at the charging enemy, calling in artillery fire so close to their own positions that shells sometimes fell among them. Colonel Edson moved calmly among his men throughout the battle, encouraging them and directing the defense even as Japanese soldiers broke through the lines in some places and hand-to-hand fighting erupted in the darkness. By the morning of September 14th, after 2 nights of nearly continuous combat, Japanese forces had been repulsed with heavy casualties and the ridge remained in American hands, though the Marines who defended it were physically and emotionally exhausted from the intensity of the fighting. The victory at Edson's Ridge proved that American forces could hold Henderson Field against determined Japanese attacks, but it also showed how close the outcome had been and how much courage and sacrifice would be needed to prevail. October 1942 brought the Guadalcanal campaign to another crisis point when Japanese forces massed for what they intended to be the final offensive that would crush American resistance and recapture the island once and for all. Intelligence reports warned American commanders that a major Japanese attack was coming, and reinforcements were rushed to Guadalcanal to strengthen the defenses, but the Marines were worn down by months of combat and disease and wondered if they could withstand another massive assault. The Japanese plan called for coordinated attacks from multiple directions, while their navy supported the offensive by destroying American naval forces in the area and bombarding Henderson Field into uselessness, creating what they hoped would be an irresistible combination of pressure that would break the American hold on the island. The ground attacks began in late October with Japanese forces pushing against the American perimeter south and west of Henderson Field, fighting with the same suicidal determination they had shown at Edson's Ridge, but on an even larger scale. Some of the heaviest fighting took place along the Matanic River, where American soldiers and Marines fought off repeated Japanese attacks and counterattacked to drive the enemy back, while casualties mounted on both sides and the jungle became littered with the bodies of the dead. At sea, the Battle of the Santa Cruz Islands on October 26 saw American and Japanese carrier forces clash in a tactical victory for Japan, but a strategic draw that left both sides battered and unable to provide decisive support to their forces on Guadalcanal. In early November, the Americans began to turn the tide of the Guadalcanal campaign through a combination of reinforcements, improved tactics, and the arrival of fresh leadership that brought new energy to the struggle. Army troops began arriving to relieve the exhausted Marines who had borne the brunt of the fighting for 3 months, bringing heavier weapons and more supplies that allowed American forces to expand their perimeter and go on the offensive against Japanese positions. The naval situation also began to shift as American commanders developed better tactics for night fighting, and as new ships arrived to replace those lost in earlier battles, gradually eroding the Japanese advantage in the waters around Guadalcanal. The Naval Battle of Guadalcanal in mid-November proved to be a turning point, as American warships fought a desperate action against a powerful Japanese force attempting to bombard Henderson Field and land reinforcements, resulting in confused night battles that left ships from both sides burning and sinking, but ultimately preventing the Japanese from achieving their objectives. American Admiral Daniel Callaghan and Rear Admiral Norman Scott both died in the fighting, but their sacrifice and that of the sailors under their command prevented what might have been a catastrophic defeat, and proved that American naval forces could stand toe-to-toe with the Japanese Navy even in the close-quarters night fighting at which the Japanese had previously excelled. As 1942 drew to a close and 1943 began, it became increasingly clear that Japanese forces on Guadalcanal were fighting a losing battle against American superiority in men, supplies, and air power. The Tokyo Express continued to make its runs down the slot, the narrow channel between the Solomon Islands, but American air and naval forces were taking an increasing toll on Japanese shipping and making it harder and harder for the enemy to sustain their forces on the island. Japanese troops on Guadalcanal began to suffer from severe shortages of food and medicine, leading to widespread starvation and disease that killed as many men as American bullets and shells, while American forces grew stronger with each passing week as more supplies and reinforcements arrived. The strategic initiative had clearly passed to the Americans, who now began offensive operations to clear Japanese forces from their remaining strongholds on the western part of Guadalcanal and to prepare for future operations up the Solomon Islands chain. Marine and Army units pushed westward through the jungle, fighting a series of engagements against Japanese rearguard forces who fought with desperate courage even as they starved and wasted away from disease, refusing to surrender even when their situation became hopeless. The contrast between the two sides became stark, with well-fed and well-supplied American forces advancing against Japanese soldiers who were literally starving to death but still fighting because their military code and culture considered surrender to be the ultimate disgrace. By late January 1943, Japanese High Command faced a painful reality and made the decision to evacuate their remaining forces from Guadalcanal rather than continue sacrificing men and resources in a battle they could no longer win. The evacuation, conducted in early February using fast destroyers that made daring runs to designated pickup points on the northwest coast of Guadalcanal, was one of the few operations during the campaign that the Japanese executed flawlessly, managing to rescue more than 10,000 starving and disease-ridden soldiers under the noses of American forces who initially did not realize what was happening. American commanders had expected the Japanese to fight to the last man as they had done on other islands, so when patrols began finding abandoned positions and equipment, it took time to understand that the enemy was actually withdrawing rather than regrouping for another attack. The successful evacuation was a testament to Japanese naval skill and courage, but it could not disguise the fact that they had suffered a major strategic defeat, losing their first significant ground campaign of the Pacific War and surrendering control of the Southern Solomons to the Americans. The contrast between the condition of the Japanese soldiers who were evacuated, many of them barely able to walk and looking more like skeletons than fighting men, and the confident American forces who now controlled the island showed just how much the campaign had cost both sides and how close-run the outcome had been during the darkest days of the battle. With Guadalcanal secured, American forces began planning the next phase of the Solomon Islands campaign, which would involve a methodical advance up the island chain toward the major Japanese base at Rabaul on New Britain Island. The strategy, which became known as island hopping or leapfrogging, involved capturing key islands that could serve as bases for the next advance while bypassing and isolating Japanese strongholds that could be left to wither without supply or reinforcement. This approach would characterize much of the Pacific War, allowing American forces to advance more quickly than if they had to capture every defended position, but it still required fierce fighting for the islands that were selected as targets. The New Georgia campaign in the Central Solomons during the summer of 1943 saw American forces landing on multiple islands and fighting through the same kind of dense jungle and determined Japanese resistance that had characterized the Guadalcanal fighting, with the additional challenge of combat in swampy terrain that made movement even more difficult. The Battle of Columbangara in July and the Battle of Vela Gulf in August showed that American naval forces had largely overcome their earlier disadvantages in night fighting and were now capable of defeating Japanese naval forces consistently, further tilting the strategic balance in favor of the Allies. The final major operation of the Solomon Islands campaign came in November 1943 when American forces invaded Bougainville, the largest and northernmost of the Solomon Islands, in an operation designed to establish air bases from which American aircraft could neutralize the Japanese stronghold at Rabaul. The landing at Cape Torquena on the western coast of Bougainville met fierce resistance from Japanese defenders, and the subsequent fighting to expand and hold the beachhead involved some of the most difficult combat conditions of the entire campaign. The terrain on Bougainville was even worse than Guadalcanal, with vast swamps that could swallow a man whole, rivers that flooded without warning, and mountains covered in almost impenetrable jungle where visibility was measured in feet rather than yards. Japanese forces on Bougainville were numerous and well prepared, and they launched repeated counterattacks against the American perimeter, sometimes penetrating the lines and creating chaos before being pushed back in fierce hand-to-hand fighting. The Naval Battle of Empress Augusta Bay on November 1-2 saw American cruisers and destroyers defeat a Japanese force attempting to disrupt the Bougainville landings, proving once again that American naval forces had achieved superiority in the waters around the Solomons. The fighting on Bougainville continued into 1944, with American forces gradually expanding their perimeter and building the airfields they needed, while Japanese forces launched a major counteroffensive in March that was defeated with heavy casualties on both sides. Throughout the Solomon Islands campaign, control of the air proved just as crucial as control of the sea or the jungle-covered land, and American and Japanese pilots fought daily battles in the skies over the islands that would produce some of the war's greatest aces and most dramatic aerial combat. The Cactus Air Force pilots who flew from Henderson Field in the early days of the Guadalcanal campaign operated under conditions that would have seemed impossible to peacetime aviators, flying worn-out planes with inadequate maintenance and living in muddy tent camps under constant threat of bombardment, yet they shot down hundreds of Japanese aircraft and sank numerous ships. As the campaign progressed and American air strength increased, Japanese pilots found themselves increasingly outnumbered and outmatched by better-trained American aviators flying superior aircraft like the F-4U Corsair and P-38 Lightning, leading to a gradual erosion of Japanese air power that they could never fully replace. The long-range missions flown by American bombers and fighters from bases in the Solomons struck at Japanese shipping and bases throughout the region, interdicting supplies and reinforcements that might have allowed Japanese ground forces to hold out longer. One of the most significant air operations came in April 1943 when American fighters, acting on decoded intelligence about Japanese Fleet Commander Admiral Yamamoto's inspection tour, intercepted and shot down his plane over Bougainville, killing the architect of the Pearl Harbor attack and dealing a severe blow to Japanese morale. For the thousands of men who supported combat operations in the Solomon Islands but never fired a shot in anger, the campaign was still a test of endurance and dedication that required different forms of courage than frontline fighting. Engineers who built and maintained airfields, roads, and bridges worked in the same oppressive heat and disease-ridden environment as combat troops, often under enemy fire or air attack, performing backbreaking labor that was essential to keeping the campaign going. Medical personnel treated an endless stream of casualties from combat wounds, tropical diseases, and simple accidents, working in primitive hospitals and aid stations where basic supplies were often lacking, and where the humid climate made infection a constant danger even for minor wounds. Supply troops who unloaded ships and distributed food, ammunition, and equipment to frontline units worked around the clock to keep the combat forces supplied, knowing that a shortage of any critical item could cost lives and jeopardize operations. The construction battalions known as Seabees became legendary for their ability to build almost anything under any conditions, from airfields carved out of jungle to bridges spanning rivers to port facilities that allowed larger ships to unload their cargoes efficiently. Even in rear areas that were supposedly safe from Japanese attack, the constant threat of air raids and the prevalence of disease meant that no one in the Solomons was entirely out of danger, and men died from malaria, dengue fever, and other tropical illnesses far from any battlefield. The indigenous people of the Solomon Islands played a crucial but often overlooked role in the success of the Allied campaign, serving as guides, scouts, laborers, and rescuers for American and Allied forces while often enduring Japanese occupation and reprisals. Many Solomon Islanders, led by colonial administrators and missionaries who had stayed behind when the Japanese invaded, organized themselves into a coastwatcher network that provided vital intelligence about Japanese ship and aircraft movements, allowing American forces to prepare for attacks and to ambush enemy forces. The coastwatchers, both native Solomon Islanders and the Europeans who worked with them, operated from hidden camps deep in the jungle, using radios to send information to Allied headquarters while constantly evading Japanese patrols that hunted them relentlessly. Solomon Islanders also served as laborers and guides for American forces, using their intimate knowledge of the jungle and coastal waters to help troops navigate terrain that seemed impenetrable to outsiders, and they rescued downed Allied pilots and stranded sailors, hiding them from the Japanese and getting them back to friendly forces. The most famous example of this came when future American President John F. Kennedy and his PT boat crew were rescued by Solomon Islanders after their boat was sunk, with the rescuers carrying a message carved on a coconut shell to an Allied coastwatcher station. The contribution of the Solomon Islands people to the Allied victory came at a high cost, as Japanese forces sometimes retaliated against villages suspected of helping the Americans, and the fighting devastated the island's economy and traditional way of life in ways that would take decades to overcome. When the Solomon Islands campaign officially ended in 1944 with the neutralization of Rabaul and the securing of Bougainville, the human cost of the 18-month struggle staggered the imagination and reminded everyone involved of the terrible price of modern warfare. American forces suffered more than 7,000 dead and twice that many wounded in the campaign, with thousands more evacuated due to disease and psychological trauma that left them unable to continue fighting. Japanese losses were far heavier, with estimates suggesting that more than 30,000 Japanese soldiers, sailors, and airmen died in the Solomons, many from starvation and disease rather than combat, along with hundreds of aircraft and dozens of ships that Japan could ill afford to lose. The naval battles alone cost both sides numerous cruisers, destroyers, and smaller vessels, with Ironbottom Sound earning its grim nickname from the more than 40 Allied and Japanese ships that lay wrecked on the ocean floor between Guadalcanal and the neighboring islands. Beyond the statistical casualties lay the human suffering of men who endured conditions that tested them to their absolute limits, who watched friends die in ways both violent and miserable, who contracted diseases that would plague them for the rest of their lives, and who carried psychological scars that no medal or commendation could heal. The Marines who fought on Guadalcanal during those first desperate months often emerged from the jungle looking like old men despite their youth, having lost so much weight and endured so much stress that they were barely recognizable, and many of them would spend the rest of their lives dealing with malaria, nightmares, and memories of things no human should have to experience. From a strategic perspective, the Solomon Islands campaign represented the first sustained offensive operation by American forces in the Pacific War, and proved that Japanese expansion could not only be halted, but reversed through determination, courage, and the intelligent application of superior resources. The campaign tied down substantial Japanese naval and air forces that might otherwise have been used to strengthen defenses elsewhere, contributing to the broader Allied strategy of grinding down Japan's military power through a war of attrition that Japan could not win. The experience gained in the Solomons, from jungle fighting tactics to amphibious operations to naval night combat, provided lessons that would be applied in subsequent campaigns as American forces advanced across the Pacific toward the Japanese home islands. The capture of bases in the Solomons allowed American forces to support operations in New Guinea and to begin the advance through the Central Pacific that would eventually bring B-29 bombers within range of Japan itself. Perhaps most importantly, the Guadalcanal fighting in particular demonstrated to both sides that American forces could match Japanese troops in determination and fighting spirit, dispelling pre-war assumptions about American softness and proving that democracy could produce soldiers every bit as tough and dedicated as those of totalitarian regimes. The psychological impact of the American victory reverberated throughout the Pacific, giving Allied forces and populations new confidence, while forcing Japanese leaders to confront the reality that they had awakened a sleeping giant, whose industrial and military power would eventually overwhelm them. Behind the statistics and strategic assessments of the Solomon Islands campaign lay thousands of individual stories of courage, sacrifice, fear, and survival that gave human dimension to the larger historical narrative. There was Marine Private First Class John Basilone, who received the Medal of Honor for his actions on Guadalcanal, where he held off wave after wave of Japanese attacks with his machine gun, only to voluntarily return to combat and die on Iwo Jima. There were the sailors who went down with their ships during the night battles, men who had only moments to abandon vessel or who were trapped below decks as water rushed in and the lights went out. There were the pilots who flew mission after mission until fatigue and odds caught up with them, like Medal of Honor recipient Captain Joe Foss, who shot down 26 enemy aircraft before returning home as one of America's top aces. There were the corpsmen and medics who ran through enemy fire to reach wounded men, who worked to save lives while bombs and shells fell around them, who made impossible decisions about who could be saved and who was beyond help. There were men who cracked under the strain and had to be evacuated for psychiatric care, and there were men who should have cracked, but somehow found the strength to continue day after day, fighting the same battles and facing the same terrors with a courage born of duty and bonds with their fellow soldiers. There were the young officers who led men into combat for the first time and had to learn on the job how to keep their troops alive while accomplishing their missions. And there were the sergeants and petty officers whose experience and steadiness held units together when everything seemed to be falling apart. In the years and decades following the end of the Solomon Islands campaign, the veterans who survived struggled to process what they had experienced and to reintegrate into civilian society that could never fully understand what they had endured. Many veterans found that the intensity of combat had changed them in fundamental ways, making peacetime life seem bland and purposeless by comparison, while others were simply grateful to have survived and wanted nothing more than to forget the jungle, the heat, the disease, and the violence. Reunions of units that had fought in the Solomons became important rituals where veterans could be with the only people who truly understood what they had been through, sharing memories both painful and proud while honoring the friends who had not made it home. Solomon Islands themselves slowly recovered from the devastation of the campaign, with the jungle reclaiming abandoned positions and equipment, though even today visitors can still find rusting weapons, spent shell casings, and the remains of crashed aircraft scattered through the forests and reefs. The strategic significance of the Solomons faded as the war moved on to other theaters and eventually ended, but for those who fought there, the islands remained a defining experience that shaped the rest of their lives. Historians would debate various aspects of the campaign, questioning whether certain operations were necessary or whether different strategies might have achieved victory with lower casualties, but such debates could never diminish the courage and sacrifice of the men who fought with the information and resources available at the time. The Solomon Islands campaign established patterns and precedents that would influence the conduct of the Pacific War and military operations for generations to come, demonstrating both the possibilities and the terrible costs of amphibious warfare in defended terrain. The lessons learned about combined arms operations, where ground forces, air power, and naval forces all work together toward common objectives, would be applied and refined in subsequent campaigns from Tarawa to Okinawa. The importance of air superiority, demonstrated so clearly in the struggle for Henderson Field, became an article of faith in American military doctrine and would influence strategic thinking throughout the jet age and beyond. The campaign also highlighted the critical importance of logistics and supply in modern warfare, showing that even the most courageous and skilled fighting forces could not succeed without adequate food, ammunition, medicine, and equipment delivered to where they were needed. Perhaps most profoundly, the Solomon Islands campaign demonstrated the human capacity for endurance and sacrifice in the face of conditions that seemed designed to break body and spirit, proving that ordinary young men from farms and cities across America could match and ultimately defeat an enemy that prided itself on superior fighting spirit and willingness to die for their cause. The veterans of the Solomons carried this knowledge with them for the rest of their lives, a quiet pride in having been tested under the most extreme conditions imaginable and having measured up to the challenge. As we look back across more than 8 decades to the steaming jungles and blood-stained waters of the Solomon Islands campaign, we must reckon with both the necessity and the tragedy of what happened there in those brutal months between August 1942 and the end of 1943. The campaign was necessary because Japanese aggression had to be stopped and rolled back if freedom and democracy were to survive in the Pacific region, and the Solomons provided the place where American forces could first take the offensive with some hope of success. Yet the campaign was also a tragedy because it required the sacrifice of thousands of young lives, because it subjected men to conditions of almost unimaginable hardship and danger, and because even in victory it left scars on individuals and nations that would never fully heal. The young Marines who waded ashore on Guadalcanal in August 1942 could not have imagined the ordeal that awaited them or the significance their actions would have in the broader sweep of history, but they did their duty anyway, fighting and dying for causes larger than themselves, and for the comrades beside them who shared their danger. The sailors who fought the night battles in the waters between the islands could not know whether they would see the next sunrise, but they went into combat anyway because their country and their shipmates depended on them. The pilots who took off from muddy airstrips in worn-out aircraft understood the odds against them but flew their missions anyway because the men on the ground needed their support. This is the essence of the Solomon Islands campaign, a story not primarily about grand strategy or geopolitics, but about individual human beings finding the courage to endure and to fight even when every instinct screamed at them to give up or run away.